Hi team, I'm Maddie. So I'm going to talk about very rapid sea ice loss events and these like coupled TPV and surface cyclones that happen before them. And it's going to be great. I'm super stoked. Okay, so what we're going to kind of talk about today, our outline. I know most people in the room don't spend all their time looking at what goes on north of the Arctic Circle, so we'll chat a little bit about studying the Arctic and some of the differences there if you're much more used to, say, the mid-latitudes. And with that, just a very quick review of remembering PV thinking as our like synoptic framework for understanding systems and things like that. And then we'll get into my favorite things, which are very rapid sea ice loss events, and talk some, if you have seen any of my master's work, then the composite means will look very familiar. They are, believe it or not the exact same graphs as was in my master's work, as we've now remade them about 3 times. And I'll talk about that. But they show us a really good like statistical picture of what's going on before with the atmosphere, or just before we have these very rapid sea ice loss events. And we see preceding this type of ice loss event, a coupled TPV and surface cyclone. And what I'm really interested now with my PhD work and all that stuff is more the dynamics of like what's going on and how are these systems evolving together. Whereas kind of my master's focused on like statistics of, hey, this is statistically what the atmosphere looks like beforehand. And so we'll get a little bit into some of the dynamics I've been playing with, and I'll talk some about sort of where I want to go with all of this. So I think it's going to be exciting. I hope you do too. So let's start with a brief tour of the Arctic. A few things that are different. One, lots of ocean, right? So when we're looking at the ocean, when we're looking at the Arctic, it's ocean that is surrounded by land, and that ocean is completely or partially frozen, depending on kind of like what time of year and where you are. And so one thing that I'm gonna talk a good amount about today is, especially when we're looking at these very rapid sea ice loss events, you really have to talk about the whole atmosphere, ocean, sea ice coupled system, and you can't really look at things independently. Another thing to keep in mind is that this is a very data sparse region. So it turns out can't put like a radio SON station on ice that moves and melts or in the middle of an ocean, right? And so we're pretty limited in those like actual observations. There's definitely like a station in Greenland, if you in Alaska, some in Russia, but we rely mostly on satellite data. And so with like the MODIS satellite, we get 2 passes a day, and then that's combined into reanalysis data sets, which is what we rely on pretty heavily for studying the Arctic. And so anytime I'm grabbing atmospheric data that you're gonna see today, I'm using the ERA 5 data. So that is hourly data that's available. You can get it up to a 1/4 degree grid. I only ever use a 1/2 degree grid because one of the nice things about the Arctic is that as you get close to the pole, that spacing in kilometers gets pretty small. So it's at most a 30-kilometer spacing. And so obviously there are issues with reanalysis data, but when you're in such a data sparse region, that's really like the best you've got. So we've got that, and then sea ice data I get from the National Snow and Ice Data Center. I use sea ice extent and sea ice concentration, and both of those fields they're satellite derived fields, and they're only available once daily. And then the other thing to keep in mind with like this data sparsity is that you only really have these data sets that go back to 1979. So the earliest we can really look at stuff is 1979. And so all of my stuff is like 79 through 2018. Okay, that's all right. There's the Arctic, why it's different than the mid-latitudes. And then another thing that you kind of deal with when you're studying the Arctic is the fact that due primarily to the ice albedo effect, you get that the Arctic is warming at twice the global rate. And so we have sad polar bears and other things, but you kind of, like, especially with sea ice, you can really see the effects of climate change happening like now, maybe in a little more tangible way than it would be in other places that aren't warming quite as fast. And so apart from sad polar bears, reasons that we like care about forecasting weather and sea ice and understanding these dynamics, there's definitely people who live in the Arctic, and as it continues to warm, their population is increasing. And then something you may have not thought of is the fact that now in the summer, unlike all of previous, like human memory, there are sea and shipping lanes open for ships that are available in the summer that aren't in the winter. And so forecasting and being able to predict when are these shipping lanes open, when are they safe to traverse, and what's, you know, how does the atmosphere, how's it going to interact with the sea ice there? That's a really big open question. So right now, if you look at, say, climate models, modern climate models don't capture our current observed trends in sea ice. We don't currently have the ability to forecast sea ice even to like, will this year's minimum be less than last year's minimum extent? So that's currently like not something we're very good at. And so let alone like, okay, is this shipping lane gonna be open next month? Is it gonna be safe? You know, I mean, not in October, but you get what I mean. So those are a lot of like the open questions and why like studying Arctic is important to like people and commerce and things for sea ice loss. Cool. So one of the other fun things about studying the Arctic is to remember that like, so you're very close to the North Pole, so the Coriolis force is much, much stronger, and so thinking in very dynamics world, if you kind of take your solutions to like the stream function, right, in the mid latitudes you get a wave, you get Rossby waves, but we're gonna get vortex solutions primarily when we're looking at the Arctic, and so that's gonna give us, instead of like Rossby waves, we'll get vortices, and so using our like PV thinking as a framework is gonna be a lot more useful a lot of the time. So a Tropopause Polar Vortex, or TPV, is just a PV anomaly that lives on the tropopause. The example I've given here is gonna be a positive anomaly, which induces cyclonic winds that can extend down to the surface. And so then if we're thinking of that, if that wind that's going into the screen there is, say, bringing equator, like air that's more equatorward, bringing that towards the pole, that's going to bring in a warm air anomaly and would induce like a positive PV anomaly at the surface. And so then you get this like TPV and surface cyclone that just like advect around each other until they end up like vertically stacked once you're like in an environment where you can destroy PV and et cetera, so forth. So this is an image I grabbed from Stephen's website back on Monday. So this is the colors there are potential temperature on the dynamic tropopause, which is the 2 PVU surface. So everywhere you see those like very dark blue circles, that's going to be a TPV, and there's a really lovely, and then sorry, the black contours are like surface pressure, and so those are looking at surface cyclones. And so there's a really lovely coupled system right there. You're starting to see like the TPV and surface cyclones start to wrap around each other. So that's really like the picture that we have when we're thinking about like synoptic skill, meteorology, and dynamics of what's going on. And I'm gonna talk a lot today about that TPV surface cyclone coupled pair. So I just kind of wanted to remind everybody of our framework. Cool. So now, what is a very rapid sea ice loss event, which I, from now on, will speak VRILE because it takes less time. And so to get at that, I kind of want to ask you the question, like, well, how do you lose sea ice? So these are the pictures that we were looking at earlier. On the left is an example of like winter sea ice extent. On the right is an example of summer sea ice extent. So the easiest way to lose sea ice is to just let the sun come out, right? So we do have a really, really strong annual cycle. Another thing to remember with the Arctic is that like in the winter, sun is down the whole time. In the summer, sun is up the whole time. So you have that very strong like seasonal cycle for solar radiation and things like that. One of the things that we in ARG have done is we took the sea ice, daily sea ice extent data from the National Snow and Ice Data Center. You take the daily difference, so you're getting that daily change in sea ice extent. And then if you just take a Fourier transform of that, you get these periods. And so definitely that annual cycle is incredibly strong going off the page on this scale. But we also see like a non-trivial amount of power in the Fourier transform at lower time scales. And so that's what I'm interested in with these VRILES. So a very rapid sea ice loss event is, simply put, a large amount of sea ice loss over a short period of time. So what we do to find these events is we take that daily daily change in sea ice extent time series and apply a 3-day running mean to it to smooth it out a little bit, and then apply a Butterworth filter and remove any period greater than 18 days. So we picked 18 based off of that bottom figure. If you take a look, so you'll see that there is a pretty big power just with a period of just greater than 15 days. And so we want to capture that period. So it's sort of, we picked 18 because 15 would be too small, 20 would be too big, 18 is just right. And so that's going to let us capture those, significant above the 95% confidence level time scales for sea ice change, right, for loss of sea ice on these synoptic time scales. So after we've applied that Butterworth filter, removing the longer period changes, then we just take the top 5% of loss events and control for consecutive days. So a great example of a VRILE is the Great Arctic Cyclone, the sea ice loss associated with the Great Arctic Cyclone of 2012. So the Great Arctic Cyclone was this very large Arctic surface cyclone that kind of came in and wreaked havoc, and it's in the summer of 2012, and it's associated with 4.4% of the total sea ice loss for that year. And so these images I'm showing you is just a satellite image with sea ice concentration overlaid from like the beginning of that cyclone's life to the end on the right. And you can see that very dramatic missing swath of sea ice. And so this is the type of event we're talking about when we mean a VRILE. And I think that's all I wanted to say about this image. Yes, lots can be said about the Great Arctic Cyclone. It's definitely like the most studied Arctic surface cyclone. But I think this is just a really lovely visual. Okay, so this is finding when a VRILE occurred is very happy, but we still have to figure out where it occurred if I want to know anything about what the atmosphere and ocean and sea ice are doing around this time. So to do that, I take the 5-day change in sea ice concentration and identify the largest connected region of loss, which is what, for this particular VRILE, that's what's highlighted in that like weird mustard yellow color. And so once we have this ice loss object, then, and this is a difference from my master's work to now, based off of some feedback I got at AMS Polar last summer. So then I find the center of mass of the ice loss object. The way that I do that is every point inside that loss object, I'm I'm going to weight by the absolute value of the change in sea ice concentration at that point, and that gives you like a single location for the VRILE. So previously I had been using the point within the lost object that experienced the greatest negative change, but this gives you a little, I think this, using the center of mass calculation, it's a little better, it's a little more justifiable kind of as the point that you're choosing. Not that that's something I've thought about a lot. Okay, so this is all happy, and these are the locations of my summer on the right and winter on the left. VRILES, just a few things to notice about these graphs is if you look at the summer, those locations are really tracing out the sea ice edge, which is definitely where you would expect the majority of your sea ice loss to be, where the ice is going to be weakest. And in the winter, that region there, that's just, I'll say straight up from like Norway, to me, that's really highlighting like the North Atlantic storm track. And so these are really, I think, there's some evidence or some things to suggest, even just in these location videos. I said video, I definitely meant image, sorry team. Just in these images that surface cyclones are going to play a big role, just based off of the locations. Okay, so very cool. That's what a VRILE is, when they happen, where they happen. Now let's talk about the atmosphere. And so this is, so to get these images, what I do is I take mean sea level pressure and potential temperature on the tropopause. And for these, this is centered on that center of mass point. So I take a 6,000 kilometer box centered on the location of the VRILE, project it into an evenly spaced map projection, and then I'm able to like take a mean of all of those values. So the black contours are mean sea level pressure, and the red and blue shading is for potential temperature on the dynamic tropopause. And both of these have been turned into standardized anomalies. So then that's based off of the mean data from 1981 to 2010. So all of the units that you're seeing here are standard deviations. And then the gray stippling that you can see, that is statistical significance greater than 99% confidence, based off of a bootstrap resampling method for, this is for the mean sea level pressure field. And so what we see really come out really strongly is that pressure gradient that is just going right across the VRILE location. So we see a really strong pressure gradient in both the winter and the summer. And then we also see that positive potential temperature anomaly above, on the tropopause above that pressure gradient. And another thing to notice here that I find very interesting and I'm really curious about is that this pressure gradient in the winter is strongest 2 days before. You maybe could make an argument that it looks stronger a day before, but still 1 to 2 days before the VRILE occurs is when this pressure gradient is strongest. But in the summer, it's pretty clearly the strongest the day of. And so you're getting this difference in timing of when is this pressure gradient the strongest, and we'll come back to that here in a little bit. So after I made these lovely composite images, I then shifted the center away from the VRILE location to the closest local minima and mean sea level pressure to the VRILE. And when we do that for winter and for summer, but we see a very strong surface cyclone signal. But you're also even still seeing the whole pressure gradient, which I think is very cool. And there's our winter composite, and here is our summer, kind of telling the same story, right? A strong surface cyclone. And we're also starting to see something that looks like a TPV up on the tropopause, but the signal I think is a little washed out in the mean. So I recentered stuff one more time. So we started at the ice, then we found the mean sea level pressure minimum, and then from the mean sea level pressure minimum, we're going to find a minimum anomaly on the tropopause and recenter everything here. And so the one difference in this image from the ones you were seeing previously is that now the statistical significance is for the potential temperature signal, not the mean sea level pressure. But we see here a very clear surface cyclone TPV coupled pair, kind of like we would expect when we're thinking about that PV thinking. So this is lovely, in my opinion, and there's our winter and our summer, again, kind of telling the same story. But if you stare at these images, like I have for many, many months, after you stop going cross-eyed, then I started to see that one, I am interested in how the coupled TPV surface cyclone system is going to develop in time. But I also think that here in the summer, they're most vertically, like they're closest to being vertically stacked here, like on the day of the VRILE, but in the winter, it kind of looks like they're closer back here on day 2. And that is kind of telling the same story as when the strength of the pressure gradient was the strongest. And so that's one of the reasons I'm really interested in how the TPV and surface cyclone are developing together, because it appears like there's some seasonal differences in how that's going to happen. And I'm interested in sort of, is that really what's going on? If it is, why? And trying to understand the dynamics of what we've got going on here. So let's chat a little bit more about that TPV and surface cyclone developing together. And so one of the kind of my big question here is, are there seasonal differences in how the TPV and surface cyclone develop in the days leading up to a VRILE? Well, to talk about that, I think we need to spend a little bit of time chatting about how a surface cyclone can affect sea ice. And so there's 3 main ways, and I'll talk about each of those individually. And these come from, there are a handful with those papers cited on this slide of observations of large sea ice loss events associated with a surface cyclone, where sort of you happened to have a research vessel present. And the mechanisms that they observed was, one is going to be accelerate sea ice flow breakup, and that's flow, F-L-O-E. So a sea ice flow is the thing the sad polar bear is standing on. It's these large kind of chunks of ice that are in the marginal ice zone. So the picture you may have in your head about what Arctic sea ice looks like is like solid ice pack and then like edge open ocean. But in reality, there's this region called the marginal ice zone that looks somewhat like this image, right? Where you have larger chunks or these ice flows that are a transition zone between the solid ice pack and the open ocean. So one thing that you can have is the strong winds of the surface cyclone accelerating the sea ice flow breakup, and that's just very simply small ice, easier to melt than big ice, right? And I have a bit of a side here, sorry. So some of the work that some of the stuff I've played with, like in the background, is trying to understand, like, hey, is the strength of the surface cyclone one of the things that's important for these VRILES to occur? And kind of every way I've tried to look at that picture, I've tried to get at that question, has been, no, the strength of the individual cyclone isn't a significant factor in whether or not a VRILE is going to occur, but the pressure gradient is. So what I think is going on, so in the Arctic you have a fairly persistent region of high pressure over the Beaufort Sea. And so what I think is going on is that you have this surface cyclone that's interacting with that high pressure system over the Beaufort Sea. And so you could create a strong pressure gradient that's not necessarily dependent on just the strength of the surface cyclone itself. It's also dependent on the strength of that high. So you have the surface cyclone interacting with that high pressure, creating a strong pressure gradient, generating these strong surface winds. And while definitely the winds themselves can accelerate sea ice flow breakup, what I think, I guess what I hypothesize to be the most important factor here is going to be then the ocean surface waves induced by those winds that then go in and smash, break up that ice in the marginal ice zone. And those wind-induced ocean waves can drive very far into the marginal ice zone. It's not just affecting the edge. And that was shown in, I think it's the Asplin 2014 paper where that was discussed, but I might have to double check my source on that. So that's what I really think is kind of the most important mechanism we've got going on here. And then I will briefly mention this third mechanism. So mix up warm ocean water from beneath the freshwater cap. For those that don't deal with the Arctic Ocean all day, so the Arctic Ocean, its density is primarily a function of salinity, not temperature. So what you have is relatively cold but less saline Atlantic water on top of warmer but saltier Pacific water. And so if you have, again, these strong surface waves, you can induce that vertical mixing and actually bring up warmer water from below that freshwater cap. And that could also accelerate melting. In my future plans is, so I want to be able to test that hypothesis that this most important mechanism is those ocean waves. I want to use CESM with impasse as the atmospheric component. And one of the great things about CESM and its ocean model is that you can have ocean waves are sort of a separate thing that you can have. So you could turn off, for lack of a better term, the vertical mixing, but keep the waves on. And so as soon as we have that running on Arctic, on our local cluster, I should actually be able to almost directly test the hypothesis of which of these three mechanisms is the most important. So I'm very excited about that. We're just technical issues, as is the bane of all PhD projects, right? And I think this also gets at some of what's going on in the difference between the summer and the winter VRILES. So if we think about what's going on in the winter, we have a more solid ice pack, and the tendency of the ice is to grow. So the tendency of our sea ice is to freeze, not to melt. And so if you have an ocean wave coming in, it's going to be interacting with, relatively, even though it's ice in the marginal ice zone, it's still relatively thicker or more ice, or maybe even a more solid ice pack, is kind of what I'm thinking is going on. This is hard. This is where getting into this is a data sparse region, and it's hard to get good sea ice data to test some of these hypotheses. But I don't know, that's what I like about it. So I think what may be happening, why you're seeing the strongest signal from the pressure gradient happening before the actual ice loss, is you might need to break up the more compact or the larger pieces of ice in the marginal ice zone. And then just taking a big piece of ice and say breaking it in half, but both pieces are still there, wouldn't be picked up by, say, a satellite as sea ice loss, right? It's only going to be sea ice loss when those are completely broken up, moved out of that region, things like that. So whereas in the summer, where the tendency of the ice is to melt, then when that pressure gradient and those wind-driven ocean waves come in and interact with the marginal ice zone, then the ice there is kind of ready, for lack of a better term, to be lost, right? So it's already thinner, more broken up, easier to Hulk smash and break apart. And so I think that may be getting at why there's those apparent differences in like the time lag of the pressure gradient. Okay, sorry, we spent a lot of time on this slide, but I have a lot of thoughts on this stuff. So, and then this is just putting side by side the summer and winter TPV centered composites to kind of reiterate when you see that vertical stacking. Okay, and so all of that to get to this seemingly simple plot that I am incredibly proud of and may have been trying to get for the last like 6 months or so, because all that stuff. After trying a few different methods that ended up not kind of getting at the question I was asking, Stephen was definitely very helpful in that. What I finally was able to do to look at just this vertical structure is the picture you've got here. So let me tell you what this is. So this is, I start at the location of the surface cyclone. So this would be, it's the same location that I used to make like the cyclone-centered composites. So I start there, and then I look in the vertical PV field. I look at PV anomalies, and I do smooth that field a little bit because PV is a very, very noisy field. And then I skip over like the surface. So I look from the location of the surface cyclone up, starting at 900 hectopascals, for the largest positive PV anomaly that's no more than 500 kilometers from my surface location. And so then I go to this new point on the 900 hectopascal level and look one level above it for the largest positive PV anomaly that's no more than 500 kilometers from this new point, and stair-stepping up from there. And when we do that, let's see, what I find incredibly interesting about this plot, now that I have all of those locations, I then plot their distance from the original surface value, which is what you're looking at here. And this is the mean for all of my summer VRILES, and this is on the day that the VRILE occurred. Got a little ahead of myself and forgot to say a few things there. But I'm really excited about this plot. And this is definitely one of those things where I finished debugging the code to make this on Monday. So I'm very excited about it. And I'm really fascinated by that near vertical section in the middle. Which I think is an indication that we are getting that like vertical stacking of the surface cyclone and TPV. But let me talk about the kind of other two regions where you have that kind of linear change above and below the vertical-ish region. So above is starting at about 500 hectopascals. We're in the Arctic, not the mid-latitudes, so the height of our tropopause is much lower. And 500 hectopascals is a completely reasonable height for the tropopause. So that kind of linear-ish moving away from our initial point there, that could very well be stratospheric air being stratospheric air and unrelated to the system that I'm interested in. Because again, that 500 hectopascal is a pretty reasonable height of the tropopause. And then for the region below it, where you have that kind of just increasing distance, I think, and this is something that in the last couple of days I've been reading a lot about Arctic boundary layers, because getting up to, that's what, 750-ish hectopascal, very reasonable height for an Arctic boundary layer. And the boundary layer in the Arctic is incredibly, incredibly stable, especially in the summer when you don't have a diurnal cycle. And so and also then PV in the boundary layer can be a very strange, messy field. So I do think, looking at this, that we are getting that vertical stacking day of for the summer. Other things I'm working on but don't really have in a state which is ready to present is the time evolution of this tilt term here. So going backwards in time, and then also, of course, doing this for winter events as well. So that's kind of all in my queue right now, stuff that I'm working on. But I was very happy that I had these like new results that I could share with you guys today. And hopefully you understand why I'm so excited about this, again, seemingly very simple plot. But that's really kind of all I have to share with you guys today. And yeah, I guess with that, sorry, the whole time I've been giving this presentation, I can't see any of your faces. So I'm like not convinced I'm not just talking to myself and my dogs. But with that, I think I will stop sharing and stop presenting. There we go. And take any questions y'all might have.